I think you're seeing it now. We're going to talk about design thinking. So thank you very much for bearing with me, and very welcome to the innovation series. And we're going to talk about design thinking and the impact that it might have on agriculture, agri-science, the way we actually use our land. This innovation series is brought to you by B-Link Innovation. And for the people that don't know us, we do three things. We try to connect people. So at the moment, we're connecting you virtually. Hopefully, as of next month, we will do our events in person again, so you can actually see real live people rather than looking at a screen. We truly believe that if we connect people, that then people will start to talk to each other. And 9 out of 10 times, if you have something interesting to say and the other person is interested about it as well, a potential collaboration will actually start. And we truly believe when people actually start to collaborate, to work together, that the real innovation takes place. A little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and will be emailed to you. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. And so you can type in your question and I will leave it up to Hamish, and I will introduce Hamish to you in a second, because he will be emceeing the event. Then letting you know that you're all muted. And so if you want to interact with our wonderful panel of speakers, you need to do so through your Q&A button. Please, if you like what you see, please get social with us. And now I'm going to introduce Hamish. Hamish is my colleague, and B-Link Innovation is a full business unit of Lincoln University. And Hamish is my colleague at the university. And we are, I'm really happy that he will actually share this session. And because we are going to talk about design thinking, and he is very much able to give you a way better background on this than I am. Hamish, the floor is all yours. I'll stop sharing and I'll mute myself.
Thank you very much, Wim. It's my pleasure to be emceeing this session. This session is a joint session with Ag Research and Mike McKay, who's the strategy lead for partnerships at Ag Research, and our joint AXD initiative in design thinking. So I'd like to recognise them before we go forward. We have three fantastic panelists here who I've spent a number of weeks with in different parts of the world. We've got Melanie Mark Shadbolt, who's the Deputy Secretary of Maori Rights and Interests with Ministry for the Environment. We have Phil Morrison, who's a consultant and facilitator of design thinking with a range of different science organisations, government organisations, and prime ministry groups. And we have Angela McFederidge, who is the design and capability lead at Beef and Lamb. Before we get going, I think it's useful to understand design thinking and thinking about where it fits into New Zealand. I came back to New Zealand about 10 years ago, and design had taken off overseas, particularly in Europe and some of the North American markets. And it's started off in New Zealand through the Better by Design initiative with NZTE. And it's starting to grow a strength within the agriculture and agricultural sciences group. However, I would argue that in some ways it's been misused. There's really two parts to design thinking. That's really, really important to understand that it's a collaborative process, but the key part is at the front of it is in the definition of what's the problem, the collaborative redefinition of the problem. And then the second part is the creative design of solutions to that. Often what I see as I go around is we end up, as we're all experts in our areas, we end up trying to go to the solution part and not stepping back and spending enough time on the front end. And that's really hard as experts. In a design thinking mode, we need to take our expert hat off and really think about how we deal with these wicked problems, which is what we're confronting in the agricultural sector, and become explorers And then the key about design thinking is it forces you to stand in the shoes of your customer or your stakeholder and look at the world through their perspective and redefine the problem so that you can find a collective engagement and understanding of their problems, and then define those challenges and problems collectively, not just from your perspective, but from multiple perspectives, and then think about how you build the solutions. And so it's this interface of these two processes, and the three speakers we have today have a whole lot of experience in grappling with that challenge and how to help experts take off the expert hat and become explorers. We've got a whole lot more sensibility and understanding of our domains than just our expert part, but often in New Zealand, we're not willing to share all of that because we don't have a safe haven and a safe place to do that. And so I've asked the three speakers to talk about it from their different perspectives and some of the key insights of using design thinking with an agricultural science, primary industry, environmental perspective, and the experience of bringing these different stakeholders together and creating collaborative engagement, and how design thinking is becoming one of these toolkits. We should think about it as a methodology and a toolkit, just like you have accounting and you have strategy. Design thinking should be one of these collaborative tools that you can bring to the table and becomes part of the DNA of everyone across the industry as we move forward. And so it's got huge power, but it's in how we use it. And it's not just a one-off workshop for 2 days. It's actually a long engagement of thinking about how you use design thinking within the organization and between organizations. And it's a marathon, not a quick sprint. And often we think it's a short sprint. It's actually this long engagement that we have to have. But anyway, I'm going to pass on to our three speakers. And so I see Melanie's just come back up. So I'll pass over to you, Melanie, and let you go forward from here.
Oh, kia ora koutou. Kia ora, Hamish. I'm hoping that people can see my screen and that it's all good to go. So tēnā koutou, ko hui hoi mai nei, e mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua o te wanako auraki ko Ngāti Whiki, e mihi ana ki a Hamish, te kaiwhakahaere o te hui nei. Ko Tararua tōku pai maunga, ko Wairarapa moana te moana, ko Rua mahanga te aua, ko Taki Timu te waka, ko Kahanunu te tangata, ko Ngāti Kahanunu te iwi, ko Ngāti Kahanunu ki Wairarapa, arawa ko Kahanunu tamaki nui a Rua te rohi, ko Papa Wairau ko Kaitohi te marae, engari no Ngāti Parau te aroa, te ati awa Ngāti Raukawa, tūwhari toa oku iwi hoki, ko Mel Mark Shapelt tōku ingoa, e mahi ana au he tumuaki tuarua ki Manatū mō te taio, te tumuaki whakarai ki te tira whakamātaki, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. As I just said, I'm Mel. I'm as Hamish introduced, the DeepSeek Māori Rights and Interests at the Ministry for the Environment and the co-founder and CEO of Te Tira Whakamātaki. I've been asked or prompted today to talk about my experiences with design thinking, and in particular how I've used it to successfully bring together collaborations, noting for you which parts were successful and what my takeaways were, and how we juggled varying perspectives and strong opinions, something that many of you will be used of. I thought I'd do that in part by talking about some of my time in the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge as the Māori director, and how Dr. Andrea Byram, the director at the time, the senior leadership team and I worked with Phil to use design thinking to determine where to invest our tranche 2 funding. I'm not going to talk about the process itself because I know Phil will do that, but what I want to do is introduce you to how we got to the point where we realized we needed design thinking and an expert in this space, and hopefully that will help me answer some of these questions for you. As many of you know, and one of the things you'll learn is I never talk to slides, they're just there for decorations. So I will give them to Will and Katie to share with people who want them. But I'll get into this. As many of you know, National Science Challenges were originally created or conceived in 2013 by Sir Peter Gluckman and Minister Joyce as a way to address big gnarly issues. So as Hamish said, these big wicked problems that we have to face. What excited me about challenges was the opportunity to do things differently, to experiment with different funding and see if it made a difference for research community and for big issues. I, like many researchers at the time, was of the view, and still am, the current funding model in the RSNI system was flawed and it couldn't do what we needed it to do. So National Science Challenges for me and others were an opportunity to think about aligning investment diversity of capability and knowledge required in our research, scale and leverage required to get transaction, how to create impact, and how to make transformational change in a system. The Bioheritage Challenge was one of the larger ones. It has 18 challenge parties, so every university, every CRI, Cawthron, DOC, and MPI. It was valued at 63.7 million for 10 years, with a further 34 million dropped in 2018 and 2019 to address specifically Cody dieback and myrtle rust. So a big challenge. Biological heritage, like all national science challenges, mission driven. And this challenge is a conglomeration originally of biodiversity and biosecurity. Two proposed separate national science challenges that Mr. Joyce thought sounded fairly similar, so he merged them together to create bioheritage. If your question was, what is bioheritage? The answer is, ask Minister Joyce. It's a merging of biodiversity and biosecurity. Bioheritage was challenged to create a national partnership to deliver a step change in research innovation. Its tranche 1 investment of around $30 million was a typical research investment. It created really cool projects that did cool stuff. However, it was also about building trust in the challenge and understanding the research landscape. So tranche 1 did cool science. It did some stuff really differently. In particular, it broke down disciplinary boundaries. It partnered effectively with Māori and invested strongly in Māori researchers. And it focused on building the right teams, not the best teams. Tranche 1 of the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge was held up as the gold standard of national science challenges, especially in how it worked with and for Māori. But it didn't save one darn tree, which was the challenge that had been issued to us by Matua Kevin Prime from Ngāti Hine, and one that the challenge took and still takes very seriously. Why did it not save a tree or a bird? Our reflections told us that it was a combination of things, as you would expect. Despite knowing that biological heritage was under threat and that stewardship of our biological heritage was every New Zealander's responsibility, our systems are complex. They take time, they take multiple skills, communities, agencies, and strong investment. People need to be inspired to act, which means they need to be brought into the research and see themselves in it. There are poor links between science and action and science and mātauranga, and the RS&I system was fragmented, as was or is the biological diversity and biosecurity investment across the board. The conclusion for us was that what we needed was transformational change, and that we could not take transformational steps without a system focus, which also included the application of the treaty principles in the science and innovation system. It was clear that there was no single solution we needed, but we needed something that would help us get better alignment, a diversity of capability and knowledge, real transformational change at scale, and an ability to leverage. Knowing all of that and going into our midterm review with MB, which required the development of a strategy and an investment plan, we decided to do something slightly different. In developing our strategy, we wanted to build off of tranche 1's successes and achievements, but we also wanted to have a stronger focus on outcomes and impacts delivered through collective and aligned investment. And we wanted an integrated approach to span the innovation pathway from discovery science right through to implementation. Our approach to developing that strategy was to undertake an extensive consultation process with all of our 18 challenge parties and a variety of stakeholders, end users, and mana whenua. Consultation occurred with the support of our governance group, our knowledge brokers, our senior leadership team, and we travelled the length of the country consulting with senior executive researchers, students, technicians, operating experts in various organisations, including iwi leaders, NGOs, industry groups, and agencies. Our goal really was to understand the highest priority needs for New Zealand in our investment. What we explained to people as we consulted with them was, we're in the middle of a 10-year work program. We have about another $30 million to spend. Co-design is cornerstone of the culture we want to create. We have a strong appetite for collective impact. We're committed to building diverse transdisciplinary teams, and we're values driven. And what we discovered was that there was plenty of advice and strategies already out there. So instead of focusing on where to put our research funding, we needed to focus on ensuring we understood what the common goals and visions were for Aotearoa. We rediscovered how fragmented investment was. For example, our challenge parties identified, and that's those bubbles down the bottom, they identified about $179 million worth of research over 3 years across 700 research projects or programs that were all aligned with the mission of our challenge. However, this diverse effort lacked overall cohesion and focus, in part because it had never been harnessed in a strategic framework to deliver measurable benefits for New Zealand. An example in the middle bubble is in the ecology ecosystem resilience area alone, there was $12.3 million invested across 127 projects. So really fragmented and often not even aware of each other and aware of the overlapping objectives and sometimes communities that they were working with. We also discovered how excited researchers were for an investment process that focused on right teams that were values driven. And this was evident in the interest in a handful of our tranche 1 investments that had had great success in constructing multi-institutional and inter or even transdisciplinary teams. So an example was in the novel technologies for invasive wasps space, we had created a team that was not only looking at developing new technologies, but had been expanded purposefully to include social scientists and kaupapa Māori researchers. The diversity meant that we not only got cool technology, but we got research and that investigated public attitudes and values towards novel technology, and research that constructed a bioethics panel to consider the ethics of tech development. This was the kind of research that was vital if we wanted to ensure that the public were able to come along on our journey with us. It was also the research that really excited and inspired the next generation of researchers. The result for us was a strategy which aimed to pull together the challenges' ambitions to be strategic, impact-oriented, collaborative and inclusive, including of different knowledge sets and holders, and long-term focused. Basically, the strategy said we have our legacy in mind. We have 5 years left. What do we want to leave behind was the focus. It prioritised efforts for the second phase of investment into 3 areas where we thought New Zealand could make the greatest impact: whakamana, tiaki and whakahau. And under those 3 impact areas, we created 7 strategic outcomes where our investment could make a difference, where it could fill in a gap or leverage off of other work. Our commitment as a science chapter was to invest in the glue that helped join that fragmented system together, join those bubbles together in the previous slide. One of the cornerstones of our new strategy was to assess what science and research was already going on that could be harnessed and focused towards common goals, to map the research landscape in order to identify what investments were out there that could help us get to that goal. Importantly, what we did not do was tell MB where we were going to invest the money or in who. Instead, what we said was, this is our mission, these are our objectives, this is the impact we want to make in the areas where our stakeholders, communities and challenge parties have told us we should invest. And the approach we will take to investing the money will be one of co-design with communities, Māori, researchers, Te Mea, everyone else. It will be a multi-institutional and transdisciplinary program. It will map the research landscape and identify the investments already out there working towards the goal, the objective, the mission. And we will assess that landscape to determine where to invest for biggest impact. MB agreed and gave us our tranche 2 investment. Plus, they gave us an additional $34.5 million for Cody dieback and myrtle rust, known as Ngā Rākau Taki, because they liked the approach. And they were very clear that it was the approach that they were interested in. So that in itself is a bit of a rarity to have funding approved without an investment plan in the research space, especially for near on $60 million. So we had the money, we had agreement on where we wanted to be, but we weren't quite sure how to get there. I'd been introduced to design thinking, as Hamish said, via Hamish and Phil through my MBA. And Andrea and I had started getting involved in the social innovation sector and the collective impact approach, with a hope to discover how we could create transformational change for New Zealand's biodiversity. We were attempting to understand how we could fully understand impact and harness investment. We approached a number of organisations and people about helping us run design thinking processes for scoping our investment. We knew we needed to further define these wickedly difficult problems to co-create the solution and co-create a solution that was inspirational enough to bring our customers, if that's what we call them, our customers along on the journey. And empathy mapping, something that you touched on, Hamish, or understanding our customers' mindset, was something that had really stood out for me during the MBA process and something I really wanted in our investment scoping process to ensure, as I said, we had that buy-in from all stakeholders and customers, but equally for me to ensure that there was a place for Māori to have a voice. However, what we found in our attempt to find design thinking facilitators, remember this is back in 2018, 2019, to find design thinking facilitators was people or groups who were specialists in human-centered design or community-based participatory research. And they were, in our view, mixing that up with design thinking. They weren't necessarily going to give us what we needed. They would have given us a great process, but not what we thought we needed to, as Hamish said again, ensure that experts took those expert hats off and became explorers to address those very wicked, complex problems. Yeah, there were definitely alignments, as I said, but eventually we had to track down Phil so that he could help us work through our design thinking scoping process, which Phil will talk more about. So I just wanted to touch very briefly on those questions in particular. How did design thinking bring together collaborations for us in the challenge? Well, when we established our scoping groups, the groups who were going to go through the design thinking process and decide what we would invest our $60 million in and who we would invest it in, we called for expressions of interest and noted briefly the process we would undertake and the types of people we wanted, i.e. we wanted people who are values driven, who are collaborative, who are inclusive, who are able to take their expert hats off. In fact, we specifically asked people not to send CVs. We said, answer a handful of questions that tell us how you're committed to the process, how you're committed to the outcome and the mission, and what these values mean to you. We had over 229 unique applications. Each applicant applied for on average 3 roles. So in total, we had over 680 applicants to go through for the scoping groups that Phil will talk to you about. That approach allowed us to pull these really diverse teams together to focus on impact and outcome. What worked for us is, I'm going to put some feedback up and you can have a look while I talk. What worked was we created a space for everyone to have a voice, a space that was safe and where participants trusted each other. It focused on relationships and being open-minded. The process was a collective approach, which was inclusive. And in this case, it was inclusive of research communities, the public, agencies, Māori, mana whenua. And it was driven by the shared vision that Phil helped the teams co-create. And it created buy-in. The buy-in created the collective commitment to a legacy of greater collaboration through stronger networks of people to solve these complex problems. And I would argue that the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge was probably one of the broadest in terms of its funded researchers, the communities that included as active research participants for a long time. I suspect it's not that way still. The process also helped people understand how to make meaningful progress towards understanding and describing impact via fewer, larger, coordinated efforts. And it helped people deal with conflict, especially in the design phase of their research. And I'm sure Phil will talk about that, but there was certainly conflict and varying views as to where investment should go or what was the right investment. Not unsurprising, is it, when we're dealing with researchers? Importantly for me, it created space for Te Ao Māori concepts, for discussion about the treaty and prioritising the outcomes, which was protecting our environment. And it took the focus off of the politics of research investment in particular institutions or researchers. It did very much take the conversations away from who is the expert and who needs to be funded to who are the right people who can get us to where we need to be. It highlighted to all participants the expectations of the challenge and the values that were driving the process. And the outcome was that the process allowed for participants to talk through their views, and some of them were very strong. And as a group or as a whānau who were passionate and committed to working together and having fun together to juggle those varying perspectives and figure out how to deal with them and address them. And so I guess in summary, for me, the design thinking process in a Biological Heritage National Science Challenge space created these shared values and rules of engagement. It created, as I said, those safe spaces and trust. It was very much focused on the collective approach and the shared vision and collaboration. And what it did well, again, just to reiterate, was address conflict and ensure that there was space created for mātauranga Māori, for Te Tiriti, and for Māori researchers and communities. I just wanted to finish up by saying design thinking hasn't actively been used in the ministry, so I'll put my ministry hat on now. Although the concepts very much are important to what we do in the public policy space. One of my biggest reflections being in the Ministry for the Environment for the past 3 years is that it is very much a culture of experts, and there are some amazing experts in there. The problem with experts is that they go to the solution very quickly, and they don't think about the journey to how they get there, and they don't think about whether that is the appropriate solution, fit for purpose or fit for Aotearoa New Zealand. And design thinking has lots to offer in that space, as I've just said. It's not only about thinking about a shared vision and a process and a pathway to get there, a pathway that is safe and is full of mutual respect, but it's also about being as open-minded as possible to think about how we deal with wicked, complex problems, and in the environmental space that is going to increase. We've never seen the likes of climate change before. Many of you will be dealing with climate change in your work programs. It is complex, and it's not only complex from a science perspective, it's complex from a human perspective. In fact, humans are the hardest part about climate change. Changing people will be the hardest part of addressing or adapting to climate change. Design thinking offered us a process to get the human stuff right before we got into the science. And for me, ultimately, that was the biggest learning, was getting the human side of our National Science Challenge right, meant getting the right people in the right place to have the right conversations at the right time before we got into where we spent our $60 million. And I think that's been the big shift in how the Biological Heritage Challenge has approached its tranche 2 investment. So kia ora tātou, I'll leave it there and I'll hand back to Hamish.
Thank you, Mel. That was fantastic. We've got time for questions afterwards, but right now I'd like to hand over to Phil Morrison. And Phil's going to talk about the process and the experiences as a facilitator within the environment that we operate with, and some of those challenges of working with experts and turning them into explorers, and some of the tricks that he's learnt.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping everyone can now hear me and can perhaps see the slides I'm sharing on the screen. I'm getting a thumbs up from Hamish, so that's positive. So design thinking, often people who have had some distant connection with it or a brief engagement with it will often think, isn't that the thing with all the post-it notes? And yes, there is a lot of post-it notes we often use when we're design thinking. But for me, the real value in the process when you're immersed in it, it's about the conversations that are occurring at the canvases where those post-it notes are being shared and discussed. So it's very much a social technology is one way of thinking about design thinking. I've snipped this particular slide from another presentation that I recently used, but I guess it speaks to this sense that if we're thinking about ways of doing strategy, there's this emerging paradigm, and it's driven by that VUCA environment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that's emerging in our environment. And Thomas Friedman talks about the great acceleration that we're experiencing, and climate change is part of that, along with population growth and technology acceleration. And so this concept of strategic design versus strategic planning emerges as a really helpful way of perhaps responding to that more dynamic environment. So 2019, Mel approached me and asked if she thought I could assist with some design thinking support for the Biological Heritage Science Challenge. It was a Zoom call, I think, where we had that conversation. And when she said, do you think you could do this, Phil? I said, sure, yeah, we can make that work. And I might have had my fingers crossed behind my back, hoping that we could pull it off. But as it turned out, it was a pretty chunky engagement. And I've just listed there, as I was counting through how much of my time I committed to this in 2019, it was about a total of 44 workshop days, physical face-to-face engagement. So it was a pretty chunky piece of work, and it was a fantastic piece of work for me professionally to be involved with. I learned so much from the process. A really positive feature was the fact that Ronald Duncan from Manaki Whenua, a social scientist, actually shadowed us through the process and did a research report on that. And that's a research report which I think's pretty valuable because of some of the insights it throws up. A little bit more on that shortly. But Ronald asked me, as we were at the end of the process, she was doing some follow-up interviews, and she asked me, so what was the rationale for a design-led process? And I guess there's my response to that question shown on the slide there. It wasn't a short response, but to me it was around, how do you bring together people with different worldviews, different mindsets, different experiences, and how do you bring them together from different agencies and organizations? And how do you harness all of that knowledge and experience to find innovations that will respond to these meaty challenges? The cool thing that came from that was Ronlyn identified what she called the 9 foundations for effective co-design. And they're listed there, and there's more detail provided in the research report. So I really would recommend that if people are interested in this, having a look at that particular report to see some of the insights that emerged from that 2019 experience. Since 2019, interestingly, during the subsequent pandemic years from 2020 through to now, that work with the Science Challenge has driven engagement with a bunch of other agencies who have a science or research orientation to the work they're doing. And it's been a real pleasure to support the agencies listed there on this slide. And those have been a range of engagements, from half-day workshops to multi-day engagements. Some have been face-to-face during the pandemic, of course. Some have been online. Some have been really quite limited, focused projects, whereas others are part of wider organisational impact projects. So for me, it's been an opportunity to benchmark against that initial experience with the Biological Heritage Science Challenge and kind of reflect on what are we seeing as others seek to make use of design thinking for co-design in the science and research space. So some of the insights have emerged for me. I love this quote from Picasso, what good are computers? They can only give you answers. And I guess this speaks to the importance of framing really good questions. We use this model, we refer to it quite frequently. I certainly do in my work. It's the UK Design Council's double diamond model. The diamond shape reflects this idea that we start with what we think is the problem, and we diverge in our thinking, flaring outwards during the first step, the discover step, before then converging once more to define what we think the problem actually is that we're solving. And then once more we diverge as we consider what are the possible ways of responding to that problem, before then finally converging to define what we think is a solution to it. So another way to think about that is in the first diamond, we're focusing on defining the problem. In the second diamond, it's about defining potential solutions to that problem. Another way is, if it's in a co-design space, let's make sure that we co-design the question and lock that in first before we then start thinking about what might be the answer to that question. And so that brings me to this thing called, the role of empathy. What has empathy got to do with this process? And what I've found is that when you're working in a co-design space, we use empathy in a different way than if we were relying on empathy in a business innovation challenge. When we're using co-design for social, science, or community issues, we find that empathy really helps the participants to better understand each other, understand their perspectives, what they need from the engagement, what's their orientation to the challenge, and thus what are the mutual opportunities that will emerge as we respond to it. Co-design participants will see and recognize their voice and input within the outcomes of that work, and thus they're going to have a great degree of ownership for what emerges and for making it happen. And ultimately, it should mean that those co-design beneficiaries that we're seeking to support are better served by the outcome of that effort. This is an example, and this is a really busy slide. I just give you a quick glance at it. This is an empathy map that was developed during the Biological Heritage Science Challenge. It was an interview with an iwi environmental advisor, and I'm sharing this one because this was one of the more powerful empathy maps that emerged from that effort. And I'm going to zoom in now on a selection of the text boxes that emerged through this empathy mapping process. And here they are here. And these are the words of that person that was interviewed. And it kind of gives you a real feel for some of the pains and the challenges that they were experiencing and what they might need going forward. And this is just a subset. It's not the complete thing. But this idea that, when you're working in the iwi space, representing mana whenua, people are really spread thin. often they're the voice of dissent, a minority voice of dissent, which makes it really hard. They're functioning across a whole bunch of committees and boards, and because they're so heavily invested in so many, they perhaps can't pick up the same amount of workload that each of their counterparts do on each of those boards and committees. And so this issue of capacity shortfall really emerges as a constraint and a concern for them, and as a pain point. And I'm sharing this because this was one that really helped to unlock understanding. I mean, this is only one of about 70 plus empathy maps we did within the challenge, but that empathy really saw people's orientation towards other stakeholders shift significantly and in a positive way. You heard people saying, wow, I actually feel sorry for a stakeholder having better understood how they have to engage with the world. So what's empathy got to do with it? It helps to just bring that understanding to the surface. But it's not just about having co-design participants participating in the process. You've really got to make that effort to put a canvas up or put some product up and actually start making visible some of the pains and the gains and some of the empathy insights that emerge. So throw a canvas on the wall and actually start to explore what it feels like for some of these stakeholders. That's really important. A few insights on facilitating with researchers and scientists in your group. It's probably a little bit unfair of me. It's not quite as bad as herding cats, but there are some cat-like characteristics of scientists and researchers in that they're quite independent, and they certainly have their own mind when it comes to thinking about issues. What I did find is that you need to manage expectations when working with scientists and researchers. They are naturally curious and they want to know what you're doing to them. So you need to flag to them, yes, there will be conflict, because if there's no conflict, then we're probably not being sufficiently creative. So that will occur. And I guess to reassure them, that's the role of a facilitator, is at times to blow the whistle and if need be, hold up a yellow card to keep the team on track. I would often remind the participants in the workshops that the journey we were embarking on is not necessarily a linear journey, and not like this train track through the Nullarbor desert of Australia. I'd encourage them to think more of the journey as a bit more like our Relrimu spiral railway track in the North Island, where we would twist and turn. Sometimes you would feel like you're in a dark tunnel and you couldn't see the light at the end of it because the tunnel was curved. But to a degree, trust in the process, that it would bring us to a higher elevation and send us on the way towards the destination more effectively. I guess this cartoon resonates with me, and it's one that I think of when I think of co-design and design thinking. From the cartoon, the US cartoon Pongo, we have met the enemy and he is us. And I think it speaks to, for me, it speaks to the fact that often we are our own worst enemies. We have limitations, we have blind spots, we have biases. And so if we accept that possibly we are our own worst enemies, design thinking offers a safe pathway forward. I guess in conclusion, what do I think design thinking offers? Here's a bunch of ideas that I think perhaps are pertinent. It provides a way for folk with different worldviews, knowledge sets and experience sets and different agendas to innovate collaboratively in response to common challenges. I am constantly surprised at the way it subdues individual agendas and in favour of collective interests. We certainly want experts in the room, but we don't want them to be confined by their expertise. We're always hunting for those synergies. And then even in the face of uncertainty, design thinking encourages action. I really love how it harnesses that deep-seated human bias for learning and promotes failure as valuable in accelerating the expansion of knowledge. So we actually are interested in the failures as much as the successes. Specifically for the science community, design thinking complements science. We're not suggesting it replace it in any way, but it can really support scientists and researchers to make sure that their science investment is prioritised, targeted, and responding to the most pressing needs of our communities. I would suggest that it helps support science investment that is structured and sequenced as part of a wider cohesive program where such programs are being operated. It complements associated investments of other types that might be linked to the science, whether that's adoption, extension, and commercialization. And most importantly, I think it really helps to build sound relationships amongst those folk who are participating in the co-design effort. And ultimately, it supports good outcomes for those beneficiaries of that science investment. So that's what Phil had to share. I will stop my screen share at this point and hand back to Hamish.
Thank you, Phil. That was fantastic, walking us through the process. I'd like to now pass over to Angela McFedridge, who is the design and capability lead at Beef and Lamb, and she's going to talk to you about some of her experiences using design thinking in the beef and lamb community around New Zealand. Ange. You're on mute.
There's always something. Good morning, everybody, and it's great to have this opportunity to talk about using design thinking as very much so as a practitioner and some of the realities of it. And so, you know, this the first slide that I had up here. There we go. The first slide, that little diagram on the right there, it's very purposeful having that in there because it really represents what
Just a minute, it hasn't been shown yet.
Oh, hasn't it?
Here it is, now it's coming up.
There we go. Sorry, after 2 years of life on Zoom, you'd think I'd have it sorted. So the little diagram we've got there on the right-hand side, it's really no mistake that that's there. It's it really represents what it can be like to be with people within these projects. And also having a big wall there is another really purposeful part of the slideshow, because we really need to start from a very clear mindset in a blank space. So there's 3 key points I really want to cover in here, just to really help you think through what it's like being in the midst of a design thinking project. And we've heard a few times already this morning that there's a real art to maintaining a curious mindset, helping people to leave their expertness at the door, bring some of it forward for sure, because some of that can be also useful for teasing out insights that other people may not see. And particularly in the work that I'm doing with farmers, because we live and work on a farm, I've always been involved with farming, I can take that little piece of mindset and it helps me to ask really good questions along the way, but also to be an experimental person and also to explore new avenues. So really helping people to sort of let go of a very closed mindset and to be a little bit more open and maintain curiosity. I think it's really important to help people start with where the people are within your project. So, you know, be a little bit more than empathy. I think sometimes having compassion can be a really good skill set to take with you. And as an example, I can remember taking a colleague with me to do an interview with a farmer. And on the way, I sort of always say the interview starts when you get in the car. So you've really got to start looking and observing, because that's really kind of part of your skill set, is really understanding what's happening in these landscapes. What does it look like? Do things look like they're a healthy colour? Do things look happy and healthy? What can you see? So that by the time you get to this work with your stakeholders, you've already got some really good questions that you can start to ask. And I think interestingly, when you sit down with those people and start talking to them, it's showing them that you're actually really interested in their world and where they are. And I think it also helps to humanize what you're doing, and that's so important. I think we really have to use this design thinking piece of the work, the way we think about people, the way we think about data in a really human way. People are not data, and people with the animals are certainly not data either. And it shows when you go back to people with your insights and with your bits of innovation, ideas you want to test when you're really kind of finding out where the truths are. It's really, really important. So really being observant is so, so important. And I think one example I had was that we went out and talked to a farmer. I could see where the boundary fence was, and everything had changed. It was quite a different way of farming. And when we got to this particular house, I remember stepping over lots of beer bottles. There was little bags of rubbish everywhere, and it really would have been easy to have judgment. But when we dug, the reality was that this particular person was really dealing with the grief of losing his 36-year-old fiance to breast cancer. And so that gave you a completely different mindset. So for being curious and for having compassion, we were able to dig deep and really get to the key of what this particular person's biggest challenges were. And that was incredibly rich. It would have been very easy to make judgment in those circumstances. And also not having big boundaries, where when you're working within these projects, one of the things that I've noticed is that it lowers the hierarchical boundaries with people that you're working with. So if somebody who's on a higher pay set or a higher pay grade or more authority, they actually have the same voice and reasoning as everybody else that's in your team. And it's really, really important. It helps you to bring out that curiosity, and it also helps to build trust within your team as well. The area around surfacing deep surface and deep meanings and insights is also super important. I think so often it's very easy to go to market and gather information, but really all you're getting from people is surface information. Through a design thinking methodology, you're able to dig much, much, much deeper and get to where the key insights are and the key meanings of things. And when you can do that, you end up with a whole heap of information, which is far more static rather than in the here and now. And of course, when we can build solutions and strategies around things that are deeper and more static, then you're going to have a strategy which is going to be sustainable over a far longer period of time. So that's super important. Never, never settle just for things that are on the surface. It's always really worthy of digging deeper. The power of return is also really important, and we talk about this. You hear different words such as an iterative approach, or working up the data. There's lots of ways that we can describe this. But when we take information and test it back with our same stakeholders, effectively what you're doing is you're building a really good basis of consolidating hunches that you might have. You are able to go and test things that you think might be the deep insight, and you can build trust with your stakeholders, because in that moment, when you're taking things back to them, you're building a reciprocation effect. And that is not always about taking gifts for people. I think that that can be a nice thing to do, but really when we think about this in the most human of ways, when people feel like they've been truly valued and truly heard, then you start to build a lot of trust within not only your team, but with your stakeholders as well. And so I've been fortunate to be working with people all over New Zealand doing this very thing. And through that have built a massive network of people who I can now go back to because they trust the process and they actually trust us as people. So again, that people thing is super important. It also gives you assurance that you can deal with any bias that might pop up, because we do have this heuristic that really does like to take the shortest route from a problem to a solution. And we all do it, but sometimes when we do that, we introduce lots of bias along the way, and we're not always conscious that we do it. But I've found that every time we take things back to people and we test, is this close to the mark? Is this what you meant? Is it what you meant to say? Is it what you meant? People are really, really quick to say to you, well, actually, that's not really quite what I meant. This is more what I meant. So it gives you the ability to be able to try things. You don't have to be perfect with things that you take back to people to test, but you can certainly have a play and have the assurance that any bias that does pop up on that gets dealt with. And when you do go back to people, it's a little bit like when you have a job interview and you're driving home from an interview and you're thinking, darn, I wished I'd asked that question. I wished I hadn't said that. I wished I'd said this. And why didn't I think of that at the time? when you return to people, it gives everybody the ability to dig a little bit deeper, and you get a second opportunity to get much more information. And what I've learned recently is that in some work that we've done, we've had to return the next day to test insights. It's been the nature of the work we've done. And then on other occasions, we've returned 17 and 18 months after we've collected initial information, projects that were set up in 2 different ways. But that power of return is so important, and it's really helped us to validate whether or not we've been on the right track or not. And like I say, the reciprocation that you get from people is very, very powerful. It builds so much trust. And I think the other thing that is really, really important is helping people to stay the course. As Phil said, you know, these are not, you're not really quick sprints. There's lots and lots of people you talk to. Hamish said as well, it's not a 2-day workshop. Really staying the course is hard work. Every project that I've been involved in has been reasonably long-term. It hasn't been shorter than 12 months. And that's just all part of staying the course. So, you know, it's really easy to collect data, but it takes a long time to analyse it and test it and analyse it and test it and keep reducing back to what are the things that really matter. And I think that goes back to what we said earlier about the difference between surface insights and meanings compared to the deep insights and meanings. When we collect data, we can end up with hundreds, if not thousands of data points. But when we go to the deep meanings, then we end up with 3, 4, maybe 5 really key points. And those are things that we can deal with. But to do that, you've really got to make sure that people can stay the course. And it goes back to what's been said earlier around having a safe haven of trust. You've really got to have that. You've really got to build environments where people feel safe to socialise ideas, and those ideas might be quarter-baked, they could be half-baked. It could be that this is something that I feel like it's important to say and get up on the wall. I don't know what it means yet, but let's talk about it. So socialisation through those processes is super important. And really, it underlines everything, falling in love with the problem before you fall in love with the solution. I've been in projects where solutions have come through, and in the early days where you've got somebody who's got they come into these projects with a particular idea and really want to see them through, and it can take a long time to help people to say, well, it's not that it's a bad idea per se, but is this the right idea for this given set of stakeholders? So, you know, we really rely on the value of having champions and having facilitators to help in these processes. Working in it and working on it at the same time is never really a good idea. So when you're working in a design process, it's really good to be able to be fully in it and be able to rely on the skills of a facilitator and know that you've got a champion that has your back, because staying the course is it's something that's really easy to drop. And I think it's also really important too, just to keep your stakeholders involved. And as I said, the long-term projects, and we've never, ever left the final findings until a big ta-da moment at the end and we draw the curtains and have a big ceremony. We've always made sure that we're able to communicate some of the insights, the process, what are we finding out all the way through, because there's always going to be little side things which may not necessarily belong in your project, but they could certainly help somebody else in their project. So building trust within the process is really, really important. But I think, you know, most of all, it's the thing that I love the most about these processes is that humanization. It's just so critical. I think the recent work that I've been involved with in a MB project was that the amount of dehumanization that we have in our dialogue is absolutely staggering. But when we've used design as a process to communicate, then we've been able to build more trust in what we're doing and lower barriers. So it's work that I'm very, very excited about and would really love to be able to continue doing. And I think the other thing too is that in yourself, you've got to stay curious about design and keep learning. It's not enough to do a quick course, and it's not enough to do one project and say you know all about design. You really do keep thinking and learning about it all the time. And so since some of the early work that I've been involved in, I've developed a particular interest around behavioural design, you know, just as a means of developing insight and what are people really trying to say. And it's been through that sort of thinking that we've had some really, really big breakthroughs for the benefit of stakeholders and for the benefit of a much wider group of people. So I hope some of that helps. Thanks, Hamish.
Thank you, Ange. So it's now time for Q&A. If anyone has some Q&A, there was an initial question here by Kate Scott, which was Mel's answered online, but I think it's worthwhile having a discussion between all of us. Is what's the role of design thinking as an approach in the regional space, particularly around the environment, communities and catchments, and what can we do to make it easier for people to adopt that, and what are our views? So Mel, I might throw it over to you first, and then I'll throw it back to Phil and Ange afterwards. So Mel.
Yeah, oh, kia ora, thanks for that. And as I said in the answer, I mean, I tried to answer, it wasn't a very good one necessarily, but I just, basically agreed with Kate that there was definitely a huge opportunity for design thinking to be used at the front end of policy creation. So quite often when we go into policy creation, we go in with as Ange was just talking about, with an already predetermined outcome in our mind and a process that we're following. And that process, especially now in the current climate we're in, is often fraught for time. Which means we do lean on experts. So we're in really tight time constraints to create big environmental shifts and change policy and legislation. If you think about the current climate, we are changing the resource management system, we are changing climate change systems and legislation, we're changing the way we deal with waste. We've just announced the conservation reform to all the legislation. So there's huge amounts of change happening all within such short time frames that the natural tendency, as Angela said, is to jump to the outcome we want and then to map a pathway to get there. That doesn't create space for us to, as Phil showed in his double diamond, to do the divergent thinking about what is fit for purpose and where do we need to go, and is this going to survive the next 30, 40, 50 years and get us to where we need to be. And I think that's probably my biggest fear in the environmental space, is that we look for quick wins and we look for quick solutions to deal with a impending crisis, but those quick wins aren't necessarily the solutions that are going to be fit for long term, fit for purpose, and they don't bring our communities along. So as you said, they don't bring the regions along with them and create space for solutions that are fit for a region versus solutions that are scaled up to fit the whole nation. And so design thinking, at the front end of policy, for me, would create the system shift I think we need to ensure that it is reflective of what communities need at place, what our agencies want to see, what our industry wants to see. But I'll hand it over to the others, Hamish.
Thanks, Mel. I'll flick over to Phil first, unless Ange, did you put your hand up for something? No.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in a lot of consultation, when you go to a big hall of people and you're presenting policy and it's called consultation, unless people have got exemplary writing skills or the bravery to stand up with a microphone in front of a whole hall full of people, you don't generally get great insight back. And so what you walk away with is like, they were really angry. They're not angry. I think people are very, we react much stronger to things that we feel like we stand to lose rather than what we stand to gain. And so it's just understanding those human aspects again, which is super important. And I think through design as well, it gets away from segmenting people according to a bell curve. And so anytime anything that's presented in research and it segments people who go somewhere in the order of the technology bell curve, which is laggards, through to the early adopters and the fast movers, it's not particularly helpful. It doesn't actually help advance what you're trying to do. And I think we've certainly shown through some of our Hill Country Futures work that when we've thought about people in a very human way and we present it back to them, we've had an overwhelming response from everybody, just simply because we've taken the time to really understand what are their key problems and what are their key opportunities and what is it that people are truly trying to say at a deep level.
Phil.
Yeah, so I actually do a really good question, Kate. So thank you for posing that one. And I think there's a couple of things I would offer in response. One is that over time, we're seeing a growing number of individuals who have been exposed to design-led approaches. And so as more and more people gain experience with it, they'll also gain confidence with it if it's delivering positive outcomes. So within the science and research space, there's a growing community of folk who are growing increasingly comfortable in participating with design-led processes. And I'm also been seeing that at a regional council level in Southland, where I live and do some of my work. Environment Southland have been using design-led approaches for some of their internal challenges, which I've been privileged to support and be part of. But there's also a current co-design effort, which is a wider engagement with external stakeholders. Now that we haven't landed a final outcome from that yet, but we've certainly engaged with, stakeholder groups of up to 50 or so in co-design workshops in response to environmental challenges that are occurring. And the issue is that often at a regional level, there's a number of change initiatives driven maybe centrally, which all come together and impact on the same set of people at a regional level. And it's fantastic to be able to get a group of people together and say, so what is our response going to be to these multiple changes that are being kind of imposed upon us from external agencies and entities? How are we going to respond to that as a package, as a bundle? How will we do that as a community? So that's interesting to watch. I think there is potential for a lot more of it. And one idea that I'd be really excited about exploring is something called a policy lab, where you bring your emerging policy out to the regions. We'll get a group of stakeholders together and we'll war game what is the likely response to this policy from this set of stakeholders before we lock that policy in. So I think a policy lab approach could be a really powerful way of exploring whether policy is strong, mediocre, weak, and how different stakeholders will respond to it.
Thanks, Phil. I think there's a really interesting sort of, as I've been sitting here listening to everyone, there's this really interesting question about the early adopters versus the non-adopters. And there's what you've got as a group, and all of these sorts of things, there's a group of people who are the early adopters and they lean in and they get it. But when we start talking about these environmental questions, there's a group of people there in the middle who want to adopt but don't know how to. And so design thinking gives you this opportunity to explore with them to understand what they've got, because we often go to the experts and the early adopters who drive it all, but they don't actually understand and don't take time to understand the issues that the middle group have. And so design thinking allows you to go and understand them and what can we do to help them adopt the practices we want them to adopt and work with them in their sense and make sense of them. And then you've got this group of ones who really just don't understand it at all, who are the laggards or the true non-adopters. And that's as important a group to be able to engage with as the adopters. And when we work with experts, we work with the ones who are leaning in. But we've actually, if we want to get change to occur, we need to work with the non-adopters. And those non-adopters are really, really interesting because you get lots of really amazing insights from them when you bring them into the conversation, because they often want to get there, but they just don't know how to. There's other impediments and blockages that you've got that you don't naturally identify, and it may be outside of the way that you've framed the problem. But when you dig deeper and you really redefine the problem of those insights, you can now find solutions for ways to engage those communities and drive the change that you have. But if we just go because of the speed and work with the experts and the super adopters, we end up leaving lots and lots of people behind. And so therefore our policy and our initiatives fall over, and people blame them because they go, you haven't adopted it, but it's not designed, the policy hasn't been designed to work for them, because there's key pieces in the policy and the incentive structure that are missing, which don't allow you to engage that group of people to come forward. And that's where I think it's also really important as you go and have these types of engagements that you need an external facilitator. I see there's lots of people go around and do design thinking, etc., but they try and do it internally within their organization without an external facilitator. It's really, really important to have the external facilitator in there, because they can see some of those challenges and can nudge you at the right point in time to actually recognize and redefine. So the first thing you're going to do is actually redefine the space or the domain that you're operating in, and often expanding it to a larger group, and then bringing in a range of different stakeholders to the table as you go through there. But then you can also use the facilitator, allows you to have conversations with the non-adopters and the adopters, who are often the experts. And so you can actually have those equal conversations that Andrew's talking about, and have that open facilitation, which I think is really important. We've got another couple of questions, have we? Yep. Coming in here. How do we deal with pride and ego of high achieving scientists who are no doubt brilliant in their own fields, but often don't see the views of the world of others? Who would like to have a crack at that?
I think it's
maybe I'll go. You go,
go.
Ange. You go. You shoot.
I think just from experience, it's, you know, it goes back to being human again. So you rehumanize the said expert, but make sure that you're being human yourself, and really kind of, you know, is helping them to understand that what you're trying to do is to help them do even better work. So it's not about ego preference and winners and losers and all of that attack and defend type stuff, which can emerge extremely quickly. It's really helping them to understand where you're heading to in terms of an outcome is, because we can agree so often in terms of what an output is. But, you know, and it goes back to the beginning of setting up and really sitting down what your mission is so that everybody can agree to it, the highest purpose up front and center, so that people know where you're working towards, and it just stops that complete narrowing too quickly.
Perhaps if I could also add, whenever I'm facilitating with certainly researchers and scientists, the first step is to name the risk of people not being able to set aside their mantle as an expert. So we physically have a discussion in the opening session. This is a risk that we need to co-manage during this co-design process. We name the risk so that if you see it happening, you can tap someone on the shoulder and go, maybe we're slipping into expert mode when we should be in explorer mode on this occasion. So that's one way of doing it. Name the risk so that you can manage the risk and do that collectively. And then within the facilitation, there is a whole set of techniques we use to create more of a level playing field so that any experts can't dominate the conversation and the thinking. We create a space where everyone gets to contribute evenly. And even, you know, the old Post-it notes, they're a standard size. There's a limit to how much information someone can put on a single Post-it note. And that even of itself kind of has a leveling effect to make it for an even level playing field, whether you're an expert or a novice in the space. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can do to help subdue the risk of experts dominating the conversation.
I also think that just the whole idea of using canvases and having people stand beside each other as opposed to sitting opposite each other and lobbing hand grenades across, that whole way that you use a canvas and you design the room, which a good facilitator does, will disempower some of those. It will allow everyone, even the quiet person, to put their ideas up on the canvases and share their ideas, and that's all in having a really good facilitator as part of it. The other thing which I think we all of us do is we'll often separate in the workshops. We'll have a different workshop on a different day, where one day is about the problem definition and the next day is about the solution. So people often come in, I've got the solution. And so what you have to do is have a parking space and say, okay, we're going to talk about solutions tomorrow. We're going to talk about solutions in the next workshop, but this workshop is about defining the problem and coming to a common agreement about what the problem is, and then going away and validating the problem before we come back and work on the solution. And so as part of that, I'll often have people with hats, and I'm an expert in this, and they name what the expertise is. And then you get them to take the hat off and you walk around with a bucket and you collect everyone's hats and sit there and say, well, we'll use those. That expertise is fantastic. We're going to use that next week. But this week, what we're going to do is be generalists and explore and create that safe haven where you can have that engagement. And so there's a whole set of tricks that you can use to help deal with this problem, but it's a fantastic problem. The next question is, are there any thoughts on as to how design thinking could be integrated more within the limits of Aotearoa's current research funding structures outside of the National Science Challenges and the cause, i.e. Marsden, MB's endeavour, I suppose, smart engagements. Would anyone like to comment on that?
And we've certainly integrated it into SEEE funding, which has been really effective. So and at the moment, we're embarking on a whole extension design project within a larger project, and that is absolutely design led. And so the way that we've put that out there, we haven't been overly prescriptive about everything that we'll find out, but we have been quite specific in terms of the high-level process that we'll use and giving people assurance that, you know, this is a rolling innovation piece. These are the people we want to bring together to do this piece of work, and it was really highly regarded. And so, yeah, we're really looking forward to launching into that. So that's new work.
And I'll probably just add to that, Hamish, by saying one of the feedback that I had up on a slide was from Angus McIntosh at the University of Canterbury. And Angus's takeaway from sitting in the workshops with Phil was that despite the amount of effort and time researchers put into their MB bids, into their Endeavour bids or their Marsden bids, one of the things that we are weak on is investment in building relationships and building fit for purpose relationships. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. One is we don't have the funding to do that, and it's really hard to make commitments, long-term commitments to communities if we don't have investment. But Angus's takeaway was that actually, if he didn't build those relationships properly and from the outset, then actually his MB bid was going to be flawed from the outset. So for him, it was a real eye-opener to step away from the kind of grind process that we approach our bids in, and to think about how he could take a design approach to building the next bid. And so his takeaway was, you know, I need to halt, I need to go back to that kind of building relationships, understanding what my customers need or what the end users need from me, and to ensure that I'm building a bid that really fits around that. I think the other takeaway for me was that what design thinking does, as Hamish was saying, in that divergent space where we're thinking about what the problem definition is rather than what the solution is it gets researchers, when they're designing their bids, to think more broadly about what the problem is and explaining that problem to the MB assessors, and then where their solution fits into the wider landscape. And so I don't think we do that very well in our bids in Aotearoa. I don't think we map out the research landscape and show what our solution is in particular going to focus on, and how that's going to contribute to the whole. So design thinking certainly gives you a way of articulating the narrative about what you're proposing, I think more clearly and more succinctly, in a way that resonates with those outside of your expertise and outside of your area of, you know, your field of understanding.
And I'd add to that, I think the government's now starting to adopt the logic model out of the US that's been really successful. And I think there's this opportunity to really use a logic model which starts with impact, outcomes, outputs, and carry on. So that's another opportunity there. We've got another question here. I think that covers those ones, unless you wanted to add something, Phil.
No, I won't add anything on that one.
So we've got a question here from Andrew Fraser. Is there anywhere we can see examples of successful application of design thinking principles in change initiatives, cases, or key learnings or examples?
So perhaps I'll offer a first response to that one, and to observe that often when you're using co-design in pursuit of strategic initiatives, it does take, there's a time lag before the results will necessarily be evident. And especially when you're an external facilitator supporting other agencies to do this work, you don't always have access to what then follows within the organization. Although I always like to follow up and look for indicators, signs, or information that are available to someone externally as to how has that played out, and is that design effort, is it being used in practice? And so the work, for instance, in 2019 with the Biological Heritage Science Challenge, for me, it's pleasurable to follow on Twitter and in social media the Science Challenge and see some of the work coming to fruition that you can trace back to ideas that were shared on post-it notes and workshops in 2019, and some of the conversations that occurred around it. So it does take a while. If it's functioning in the strategic space, the results may not always be immediately evident, and neither will it be evident whether it's been entirely successful. That would be, an initial response to that question, but I'm sure others have got comments to add.
I'll be really fast and just say that a really good project in the National Science Challenge to follow, to have a look at, is the Eco Index project led by John Reed and Kitty Wallace, is it, Phil? And that project in particular really changed where, I guess, with the preconceived idea of where the directors, Andrew and I, thought it would go via the process with Phil, and they've really adopted design thinking in their whole research journey, not just in the development phase. They've taken it to heart, and they are expanding their research constantly using the design thinking approach. They are completely focused on ensuring they're delivering for customers, whatever those customers are, and they broaden their research beyond biological heritage's kind of natural customer base to include the stock exchange and to include big companies that might be those early adopters of some different types of technology that they were creating. And they've had starting to have quite a bit of influence in Wellington in particular. We're now seeing ministers pick up their stuff and kind of share it around Wellington as well. So it's a good project to follow online and to watch their process, I think.
And I think a project that I've been involved with, which was set up very much so as a qualitative study, but with a massive sample of people, being able to use design thinking tools, because it is a toolkit, it's not one set method. We've been able to adapt a design thinking method to take through some of our findings and turn them into products at the end. So even if you've set up a project and it's been set up in a way, you can still adopt a design thinking mindset and start to use those tools just to help benefit. So if you've got things underway, don't be disheartened, think, oh, we've missed our opportunity. We've done it and it's worked really, really successfully.
And I can provide a series of other examples, like this Taste of Horowhenua, which got started as a way to showcase food out of the Horowhenua, working with a group of MBA students who developed the concept using a design thinking approach and recognizing that local Wellingtonians didn't stop in the Horowhenua. They didn't even know where it was on their way to Taupo. And so how could we get them to stop and explore the region, which was on their northern boundary? So there's a range of examples out there. If you want to reach out to us, we can give you specific examples. Are there any other questions out there from anyone? Are there any last comments or from the panelists that they'd like to add in? Anything that's come to mind as they've been sitting here listening to each other? Phil?
Yeah, I would just like to share the idea that I think it's an African proverb that says, if you want to move fast, travel alone, but if you want to go far, travel with a group or travel collectively. And in some ways, design thinking for me reflects that second sentiment of, if you want to travel far, take a group with you. The reality is that if you want to pursue a design-led approach, there is an initial upfront investment required, which takes time. It takes time to marshal the stakeholders, to get them together to have these conversations. And sometimes organizations might balk at the time and expense and the effort required to do that. And they might seek a faster, cheaper entry approach to an issue. And to me, that perhaps suggests, yes, it might be cheaper at the outset, but you may pay the cost later on. And so to really give some serious consideration to the idea that actually it might be in our interest long term to meet that upfront cost of investing with stakeholders. And a second effect I've seen recently, a science-oriented client I'm working with internal group of folk doing co-design, going very well, only then to hit a bit of a speed bump where the people who manage their external relationships have said, and we think it might be too early to take this idea to external stakeholders. It's kind of half-baked, it's not complete, it's not polished. There is a risk that we might spook our external stakeholders if we take this idea or set of ideas to them. And, maybe I would challenge that thinking and say, well, actually, that's the whole idea, is you want to take your ideas to your stakeholders while they are still half-baked and unpolished, because they will be the ones who tell you in what ways you may need to adapt, change, polish, tweak, refine your thinking so that it does fit their set of needs. So, I'll just flag that that's going to be a tension that may need to be managed with large organizations, is who holds the gateway to access your external stakeholders, and are you empowered to go and talk to them, or do you need to negotiate that with someone who manages your external relationships?
There's also this, that's a really good point, Phil, because there's this conflict internally and in New Zealand where we always want to go and take a fully worked up idea with a full solution and show to people and go, look at this, isn't this great? And what we forget about in the New Zealand culture, we'll go, that's really, really fantastic. And we'll give them all this positive feedback. But then we'll go around to the pub or we'll go out to the coffee shop and go like, what the hell was that? That's just not going to work and everything else. But we'll never give them direct feedback. If you're in America or Europe, they'll challenge you and tell you that it's all wrong in the room and everything else. In New Zealand, we're too small a nation, so people won't give you feedback on a fully developed concept or idea. And so there's this real need to take rough prototypes in the design thinking process to people so that they can have an opportunity to provide you honest feedback and not feel as if they're going to threaten you because you're taking something, and because it's rough, it gives people the opportunity to debate and discuss it. If it's all fully worked out, people just go, that's fantastic. And we've all sat in those meetings where you just don't say anything and then you talk about it afterwards, and you spend millions and millions of dollars on things that you know right at the start won't work, but it's been worked along too far. And so it's what I sort of talk about is that you do the wrong thing righter, as opposed to sitting at the start and going, okay, how do we identify what's the right job to do and then work out how to do that job the right way, which this goes to the question which was just up about in funding. And science funding and IMBY's actually, I think they've got it the wrong way around. They worry about getting the science right first, and then they worry about whether it's going to have impact. What we need to do is turn that around the other way around and then say, okay, what do our stakeholders want and what's the impact that we want? What outcomes will drive that impact? And understand that first, and so then say, well, that's a really good idea, and that will provide those outcomes and impact. Okay, have we got the right science or the right process to do that? No. Well, let's add these other people to the team so we can modify it to deliver on it. But this changes this whole dynamic between the funding agency and the researcher, because everything in New Zealand is driven by the experts as opposed to driven by the stakeholders and what their needs are. And so there's probably needs to have this change. In America, we made this change about 15 or 20 years ago, and we now flipped all of our funding for the science and for agriculture, food and environment, about $1.6 billion a year, is all driven by impact first. And then you collaboratively make sure you build the science team and you look at it and review it, and then you add people on those science teams, which therefore gets collaboration, but everything's driven by impact first. Anyone else have any comments on the sort of the flipping of the model of the science and the funding model? I thought that was a good question, which got thrown up.
Yeah, it is a good question. So where we've flipped and gone from qualitative study and you then use some design thinking, reasoning, and it really helped us because the model was set up where we had absolute outputs. And so, you know, there were milestones such as we had to develop a tool. We had to develop the right tool. It would be really easy to develop a tool, tick the box and walk away, but we really cared about our stakeholders a little bit more than that. So, you know, using design has been a means to open up the door to get a great result.
Well, and that's a really good one on tools, right? Is because a tool's just an output. It's not an outcome, and it's not impact, right? So outcomes mean that you have to have awareness of it. It has to drive behavioral change, and then it has to drive systems change. That therefore that you can either measure in a economic sense or an environmental sense as far as the impact that you have off the back end of it all. And so you actually have to start with that and think about how we're going to measure that, and then work your way back to what are the outputs, and then what are the activities, and what are the inputs they have. But we often do it all in reverse. Mel, you were just about to say something.
Yeah, no, I chucked it in the Q&A, which was, you know, my initial response was, no, I don't think MB are up for it, and I don't think anyone's thinking about it across government. But then I remembered that in part, you know, apart from the RSNI or Te Ara Pairangi, you know, proposal to change the green paper, there is an agreement by cabinet to develop platform or kind of what we would call platform in the research space research strategies across governments. I think there's about 8 or 9 of them that have been approved, one of which is an environment and climate research strategy. I think another is housing, another is infrastructure. The idea is that, as Hamish said, we start thinking as a country and as a government in particular, what are the outcomes we want? Where are the gaps? What are the investment areas we need? So in the climate space or in the environmental space, for example, that might be in reporting and monitoring data, or understanding, getting better data, more reliable data. And then using those strategies, which are not created by MB, to drive MB's investment. So to try and encourage MB to start thinking about where it needs to invest prior to just having an open process that allows experts. Not saying that we don't need that. We definitely need blue skies thinking, and we need research funding for people who have brilliant ideas that many of us would never think of. But we also need to have investment that's targeted, as Hamish said, to an outcome or to an impact that we know we need, like reducing emissions, for example. So there is some shifts in that thinking that are happening slowly. I will just note that they don't have design thinking at the heart of them, and that might be something that we can, as a group, can explore after this. I forgot about that process, so I'll be no doubt knocking on Phil's door again.
Any comments, Phil?
I'm going to put a question to Mel just in the few moments we've got remaining, and it's this issue of if we are pursuing better outcomes with co-governance and with mana whenua. To me, the way that co-design allows you to span different worldviews and integrate those perspectives, does it fit well with mana whenua's aspirations using this design-led approach? What are your thoughts, Mel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really safe way of ensuring that we have co-design and co-production of ideas, of solutions, of defining the problem. The whole anything is freaky at the moment. We know that it's got a whole political movement behind co-governance and co-management and the like. But really what Māori are after is the promise that was made in Te Tiriti, and the promise was one of partnership. And predominantly, as we all know, Māori aren't in partnership right now. We aren't at the table. And for me, that's not, as Phil will know this because he's worked with me, for me, is not about equal numbers. It's about equality at the table. So it's about the ability to have a voice and the ability for that voice to be heard. And I think design thinking, and especially the way, and I completely agree with Hamish, that it has to be facilitated by an expert, and it has to be facilitated by someone who's outside of that group, because the experts, the facilitators, allow for that voice to be heard in really meaningful and impactful ways. One of the observations I made in our process, Phil, and unsurprisingly, was most of the Māori were quite standoffish on the first day. My job was to rally our Māori participants in large part, and I noticed at the end of the first day that I was having to sit at the dinner table with them, because we always had a dinner, didn't we, Phil? And kind of go, participate, share, get it, Phil's a good guy, give the reassurance. The second day they would jump in, they'd tested Phil out, they'd tested the group out on the first day, and by the second day they were jumping in, and there were post-it notes everywhere, and they had great stories and great ideas. And I think that process, because it is whanaungatanga focused, it's about building a family group, and it's about sharing ideas and manakiing everyone, supporting everyone in there, really resonates with Māori, and it allows them to open up and share their aspirations and their views and their experiences, as you showed on that empathy map. So I think it's probably one of the best processes we've got to get genuine co-production and co-design. Not necessarily going to get us co-governance and co-management, but that ultimately is not what a lot of Māori care about. We care about the outcome and ensuring that our voice and our aspirations are represented in the solution and in the pathway to get there.
We're just going to hand back to Wim now, but Ron's just thrown up one more question about how do organisations provide enough background to get good feedback without providing polished solutions. I'd then say that the key piece here is having really good facilitation and a really clear process and expectations. So you need a champion, you need a safe haven, and you need a really good facilitator going through with a clear process. And that facilitation of going through that will bring people through, as Mel said, having a really good champion who can go behind the scenes and connect people together, and then everyone knowing what the process is, that you're bringing ideas in this rough form to get feedback on it, and they can explain that process to people when you go and present it, is really, really key to get the feedback as you're going. And it's not meant to be an end product, it's so far along. And that's the role of the facilitator and the champion, to make sure that everyone's appropriately briefed as you go through. But we've run out of time. It's been a fantastic set of questions. Thank you very much to all of the panel for your fantastic insights. Hopefully we can do this again at some stage. And I'm going to pass on back to Wim.
Thank you very much, Hamish. And wow, and getting the human side right. And I think that's what you guys did as our panelists and you as RMC, Hamish, because we didn't see any drop off of attendance in this webinar. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to share my screen. I'm not going to make it any longer. Please look at belinkinnovation.com for any upcoming events and stay in touch and make sure you put the human side first. Thank you so much.
Thank you.